example, if countries want to join the European Union, they have to observe certain standards, and they're not supposed to have torture prisoners and oppressed minorities and so on. Now, of course, these don't all work perfectly, but it is generally agreed that these are standards and people are supposed to keep them, and gradually countries are working towards them, arguably, though sometimes they will work backwards as well. And people say that even if their enemies repealed the English Human Rights Act, it would last probably forever because it's been stitched into common law and precedents. So all future law cases will have to look back to the decade or so, 15 years, that we've had that actual act working in our legal systems and defending people's rights. And all those UN conventions, abstract and remote as they might seem, are having powerful force around the world to support all sorts of groups. And alongside those, there are also the international standards on medical ethics for research, so that standards have really changed in medical research, and doctors can no longer just do any experiments they want to on people. They're answerable to ethics committees and funders, and over the last 20 years there's been a real revolution about the rights of patients and research participants. And interestingly enough, of course, these international human rights all started around 1947, 48, 1950. Do you know why? What was the catalyst that got all the international standards going?
The Holocaust?
Yes. And rights are, in a sense, a defence against those atrocities. Now, the fourth thing about rights, about inner being, is you can't really understand and exercise rights unless in our hearts we understand and want to do that. And Roy Buster has taken the word of freedom, working from Pile 2 to Pile 1, in 7 forms which bring together sometimes contradictory, conflicting ideas of freedom into a great general idea of freedom. One is the capacity to do otherwise, and I'd argue babies can do that very effectively, can't they? So it is a human capacity. The next is Isaiah Berlin's about negative freedoms. We shouldn't have things stopping us. We should be allowed to walk freely around the cities, have privacy, have freedom of thought and conscience and religion without restraints. Then there's emancipation from specific constraints, and they're particularly outlined in the rights conventions and laws. Then coming on to Kant's idea of self-determination and autonomy and making our own decisions about our lives as long as we don't hurt other people. And even if we make mistakes and rash, crazy, foolish decisions, if we want to do it, then that's our right. And some people who are real risk takers argue that you're not really alive unless you're taking risks, and that's what you want to do. Even if you might die doing it, you're fully living. Do you agree with that?
What about children?
Sorry?
What about children?
Oh, well, actually, I was just thinking of 2 of my children who are crazy risk takers. One likes karting, and another likes riding horses, dangerous horses. And that, I'm quoting them when they say we're not really alive unless we can do those things.
And at what age do you think they can reach that? I'll start to think that way.
Well,
You know,
I'd say my 3-year-old granddaughter wants to ride crazy horses, and some people are like that. I'm not like that, but...
And if she had a major head injury, would social services intervene and say she didn't have a hat on and she shouldn't have been there?
No, she would have, though.
She could still have a major head injury.
I know, it's very controversial,
Yeah.
isn't it? Some people are libertarian and very extreme, and some people are very protectionist, and you... I mean, would anybody like to give an example of something they think is a really wrong understanding of freedoms to do what you want to, or
they talk a lot about freedoms which impinge on someone else's
Sorry?
freedom. They talk a lot about freedoms which impinge on someone else's freedom. So it's only acceptable for you to be as free insofar as, like you don't necessarily have the right to murder somebody because then that, kills someone else.
exactly. There are restrictions on rights, and one is that you do not harm others. Yes.
Well, I think there's a lot of the recent debates about hate speech. I think there's another example of that, people citing freedom of speech as opposed to
Yes.
the impact that has on
But
other people.
sprinkled through the conventions, there are, according to law, order and morals, public health, peaceful societies and so on. We don't just have license to do anything. We have license to live fulfilled lives within certain restraints which protect us as well as other people.
We do have the right to offend other people sometimes.
Yes. Yes. Again, that's very complicated public debate because some people take offence very easily and other people are so thick-skinned that unless you're offensive, they don't seem to understand what you're talking about. It's very difficult, isn't it? But then I think rights allow quite a lot of freedoms to make mistakes, do the wrong thing, annoy other people, and you hope also reconcile them. Because this is human nature and human interactions, isn't it? It's not just all running us like sensible machines. So after Kant's idea of autonomy, and he thought he was independent, but I think all the time he was sitting in his study writing, people were bringing in, clean socks for him and hot muffins, and he didn't actually notice that he was highly dependent. And he specifically said that women and children couldn't have rights because they couldn't be rational, so it was a rather limited idea. So to go on to that, is well-being and utilitarianism, and under that will probably also come John Stuart Mill's idea of liberty, which was much more open than Kant's idea. He thought children couldn't have liberty, but men and women could, and then they would make mistakes. They wouldn't always make the right decision, which Kant implied, but it was their right to freely make wrong decisions for themselves. Then that's on to flourishing, and Aristotle's idea, and Sen's idea of justice, which is the principles of leading fulfilled lives. And that goes on to the idea, they did too, about you can't really live a good life all on your own. You have to be within a good society, and you can't really flourish if you're depending on oppressing other people at the same time. So that, yeah.
Sorry, but at the basis of Aristotle's great chain of being was men above women and above the animals and whatever. So his just society was based on injustice.
It was, and every man in Athens apparently had to have 5 women in various capacities looking after him. Yes, exactly. So the idea of a flourishing society was one of not of slaves, women and children. It was of a small elite. And recently, though, of course, John Stuart Mill was spreading it out to all of society except children. And the last one, this good society, is the idea that nobody can really flourish unless everyone else is, which is a kind of utopian vision of the whole world. But would you agree, really, that we just can't flourish properly, be really happy about ourselves and the world, while there is such injustice and oppression? Or do you think it's possible to be perfectly happy and it's up to everybody else to look after themselves?
I think it's difficult just because you're talking about children a lot. It made me think about the oppressive nature of the school system at the moment. So how are they able to flourish in that environment? And the oppressive pressure on teachers.
Yes.
It's really interesting. I think a lot of we're seeing this kind of increasing approach on kind of controlling behaviour, and I wonder whether that's not just children protesting against the restrictions placed on them and the lack of respect for them
as individuals and as people, and etc. But it's just kind of labelled as a behavioural difficulty rather than actually the right to express their dissatisfaction or the kind of lack of respect they're getting from others. So I think you're right, it's quite becoming more and more oppressive than the school system.
Yes, and how much their behaviour is sort of protest and a dissent against unreasonable conditions rather than naughtiness or inadequacies. Yeah, worrying on two counts. One is now, the present unhappiness, and two, what kind of societies are we going to have in future if people are used to living in these rather repressive relationships and ways. And how do we work towards a good society? Do we start with the children? On the other hand, if we do we educate? Do people with utopian people going to schools and educate children how to be utopian against some of their parents' views? Is that a sensible thing to do? What do you all feel about working towards a better society? Where would you begin, and where would children come in it?
Well, I just said
education, probably.
Well, who would educate? Who would do the educating of the educators?
Good question. I don't know.
But really, that's useful because, in a way, do you mean debate, negotiation, asking the questions, having public, opening it up much more to the public as to what schools should be doing? And
it is interesting, certainly. I mean, just anecdotally, the children of friends of mine who are probably flourishing the most are all being homeschooled. And I wouldn't say that the ones who are all in schools, private or state, are flourishing in the same way. I see incredible intrinsic motivation in these children. Of course, a privileged home, that they're able to facilitate that. But I would say that they are having the chance to flourish.
yes, and also partly because there's more space for them to do their own self-learning rather than
And
have
really
mass
directed.
education.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then schools could be run on those diverse lines, couldn't they? Some schools are. Yes.
I was just thinking a bit about looking at rights as in quite kind of individualistic way, and that perhaps there's kind of scope to also look at it as more of a unit. So, for example, rights of or survival or flourishing of a family unit or a community. So I guess it's sort of that almost dichotomy of kind of Western and non-Western ways of looking at oneself. Like, probably a lot of people don't think of themselves as an individual, but more as in relation to, you know, their family or other members of their religious community or household or extended.
Yes.
Networks.
Thanks so much for saying that, because I left it out. And there are these two ideas of rights, isn't there? There's the extreme is the sort of Texan farmer, individualism, selfish, can shoot anyone who dares come into his territory. That sort of idea of my rights. And the other extreme, I think, is in the preamble to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, that says that rights are the foundation. The rights of every member of the human family are the foundation for peace and justice in the world, and that any rights that any one individual claims means that they respect everyone else's equal rights to that, and rights are equal relationships and negotiation. And surely that's a much more realistic understanding of rights than the first one, which brings rights into disrepute, doesn't it? Yeah. And also, I'm not sure about rights within families and how useful they are. I think they're underlying things. But if you have to claim them, it probably means that things aren't working at all well, and that sort of discourse isn't necessarily going to be helpful either. But there's a very useful book, have any of you seen it, called Building Small Democracies, which is about the UN Convention within the family. It's probably in the library.
Thank you.
I think going back to your question of which was how to make a happier world, or Yeah, flourishing. I think, or how to flourish, it comes back to the beginning, I think, to how we nurture children, not only when we bring them to school and all those constraints in school, but mothers also face constraints in society, like if this child is better than this other child, or is already working or learning, or so it goes to also wanting them to develop capacities, and we put a lot of pressure in mothers and children as well.
Definitely, and that's why the point made that we start with education does seem so sensible, because why treat children in a kind of unrights way for a couple of decades and then suddenly expect them to behave really well with peace and justice? Surely we somehow have to restart from the beginning. Yeah.
And also the possibility of the flourishing in the inner being is completely connected to the previous one about social structures, because if you follow Sen's argument to assess persons' well-being, you can't just say what's available for them, it's what capabilities they have to be able to live the life that they value. And so just because the incomes are equal or whatever, it doesn't mean to say that somebody can still participate to the level that they would like to. So it is all interrelated, isn't it? You can't be just talking.
Yes, and flourishing is a very annoying word in a way. It's so vague and contested. But I'm using it because it can include doing all sorts of hard, difficult, unpleasant things because you want to. Like really caring for people with great difficulty and so on. But feeling I'm doing the right thing for fulfilling my life.
I'm doing a PhD.
Yes. Good point.
Do you pick up on the point about families? I think it's something that's coming out in my research. My focus is very much on participation, children's rights, and but I think obviously working in health and social care, there's been as in a lot of areas, there's a focus on parents as a proxy, parents viewed as a proxy for children and young people. For years and years, people just asked families what they thought, or the whole issue around consent and assent, and is a parent consented that means that the child had. But actually, having spoken to practitioners, spoken to young people, it became apparent quite early on that I also needed to be talking to parents, and having spoken to a few groups of parents, what's quite interesting is kind of actually starting to make me think a lot more about the role of families as enablers and facilitators of children's rights. And I think that's quite an interesting area as well. It is not necessarily about the rights of families or the rights of children, but actually, particularly when you're talking about young disabled people, some of the young disabled people, very young children, families are quite key in enabling those rights to be enacted.
Yeah, that's really important. And maybe rather than being just things, rights are really human relationships, aren't they? Yeah. I avoided the word happiness, by the way, because we don't have a right to happiness. Do you know what the actual phrase is, anyone, in the American Declaration of Independence? The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And happiness actually means it comes from happenstance, what happens to you, chance or fate. It's not necessarily feeling nice and cosy. It means really the freedom to follow fate and opportunity. And it's been turned into rather a sort of commodity thing by the economists that they can measure and equate with, on the whole, with consumption. And that shrivels it down to a meaning it doesn't really have and doesn't really fit rights. Because we don't have a right to happiness or life, or we do have a right to people not taking our life away, but we don't have a right to stay alive forever. And we don't have a right to health, because try telling someone dying of cancer, it's all right, you've got a right to health, don't worry. You haven't. You've got a right to the highest attainable standard of health and standard of healthcare. Highest attainable, I mean within finite human limits. Yeah, did you want to say something? No.
I was just going to add on from Luke, where you were saying about talking to children in health is about their rights and participation rights, and bringing in parents and stuff, and how they can be enabled. And I don't know if you found the same thing, when I've talked to lots of people working in health services, and particularly at the moment, because of all the cuts and the way that the services are being cut, and and the way that actually workers feel their rights are being denied, that then translates into how they perceive the rights of those people they're working with. So if we try and do any work around kind of developing an understanding of rights for children and families within their health, so particularly in mental health context, in my experience, actually what the kind of underlying messages that come from practitioners are, but no one listens to me, my rights aren't respected, so why on earth should I do that to anybody else?
Yeah.
And this kind of negotiation of rights based on, I think we often ignore we don't see the rights of workers in those situations as impacting on then the rights of the people that work within those services.
Definitely, and also it comes back to social structures and the practicalities that if you're a carer going in to get an old lady out of bed, dressed and ready for the day in 15 minutes, you cannot do it in a respectful way that adjusts to her needs and rights. And you must feel very angry and frustrated that you cannot work as to the professional standards that you want to. Now the emphasis in the UNCRC isn't on protecting and providing for disabled children so much as their participation in general society, and that photo comes from one of the most inclusive schools in London, where every local child is welcome. There's a park with lots of equipment just outside the school gates, and most classes spend an hour there every day. And can you see he's in a wheelchair at the top of the slide, and being fully included as far as possible in everyday life of everybody else, so that to ensure dignity and promote self-reliance and facilitate the child's active participation in the community with the fullest possible inclusion. That's the words from the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And as I mentioned just now, the preamble says that rights are not selfish individualism, but they are to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedoms. So that they're very positive and aspiring things rather than selfish and limited things, human rights. Again, I'd argue that from birth, human beings are very aware of respect or oppression, and one is a baby being put in a bath, and babies tend to startle and get anxious, many of them, and not really enjoy that. Whereas in the neonatal unit where Rosa, my PhD, was working in London, when they first give a bath to a baby, they wrap the baby up so that there's no need to startle. Dip the baby gently into the warm water, and when the baby is obviously ready, gently unwrap the sheets so that the baby can enjoy the water, following the baby's cues and needs in a very rights-respecting way. And it's so clear that from the very start we can treat children respectfully or disrespectfully, with sort of security or inciting fear and alarm and anger in children. Now, critical realism argues that natural science, people say that natural science deals with things and social science deals with ideas, and you can't have the same methods for them. But critical realism argues that gravity and evolution are ideas. They're not actually things that we can put on the table and say, look, here it is, I can prove there's gravity. And another thing about gravity is it's working all the time, keeping us fixed on our chairs and not floating around. We can't see it, except in its effects, when things fall or because we are sitting here. And I'd argue that rights are very like gravity. They are a power that is exerting itself all the time in our relationships, and that we become conscious of it when rights are being challenged and even gently or clearly violated. Critical realism argues that we can apply positivist and empirical methods of natural science research to social science, because there are these real things with real effects, and treat rights as a power, a force like gravity. the possibility of naturalism, naturalism is the methods used in natural science, is that there are not identical methods in the social and the natural sciences, but there's a unity of methods. We can bring the insights of positivist and empirical research and the insights of interpretive and hermeneutic research, and we can apply them both at the same time to the same ideas. So we can accept the kind of factual reality of rights, and we can also explore the infinite ways in which those rights are understood, interpreted, discussed, expressed, enacted. So this is dealing with both rights as both a thing and an idea. Natural necessity is this idea that we look beyond the top levels. The empirical is what we sense through our five senses, experience, and the actual is what's actually happening. You are actually sitting here, even if hermeneutic researchers might come in and say, how do you know? We do know, we are. But a great deal of observational and statistical research just deals with collecting actual and empirical. Like, say, a road accident actually happens, people get injured, the car gets dented, we can see and record all of that. But the real is looking at often the invisible hidden underneath causal powers like gravity, like evolution. Darwin moved beyond looking at finches' beaks, the actual and the empirical, and he wondered why they all varied and decided that it must be this great part of evolution and natural selection. So these are unseen, unprovable forces, only visible in their often diverse, unpredictable random effects. Now, the point about gravity is that aeroplanes fly, birds fly, leaves spiral about. But we don't say, oh, that disproves gravity. We just say there are different forces happening here. And so gravity is a way of giving a reliable, consistent explanation. And similarly, rights movements and structures are ways, reliable ways of explaining the world, explaining respectful behaviours, explaining atrocities, and proposing alternatives. And so rights exist as real causes. And critical realism argues that among other causes, our motives and our reasons for action and the structures that we live in are causal powers of class, race, generation, ethnicity. And we behave with some freedoms, but within these structures. Now, as I mentioned, a great deal of the research going on looks at these separate variables. And so they might document at great length how you get mansions next to slums and private schools next to failing schools, and how lots of people who go to Oxbridge and then do unpaid internships somehow get into top careers. But just to document all of this would be like following David Hume's idea of all the stones falling without looking at gravity. Hume would say you can't look at anything you can't see with your five senses. He would say gravity is irrelevant. You can't prove gravity, so I don't think it exists. We've just got to concentrate on the stones that are falling, or the housing or careers that we observe. But a great many social scientists say that's just not enough. What are we doing? It's like telephone directories in the end, just documenting all this stuff. We need to look for deeper causes within these observed patterns, such as, for example, inequality, which explains these three lines and what's going on. Now, this is about open and closed systems. And natural science has experiments and drug trials and so on. But when you have cancer drug trials, you never get 100% recovered and nobody died. There's always a bit of a balance. And in social science, there's even less clear predictable results. All sorts of things happen to different people and hard to explain. What critical realism is saying is that closed systems like gravity and equality seldom have 100% results.
It's changed.
Sorry,
It just moved.
oh,
Because
did I move it? Right, yeah. Right. Closed systems with a single force, like just gravity, are very rare. You have birds and leaves and so on. And so you also have open systems where there are two or more powers going on. Now in social science you have even more open systems, usually than natural ones. And so these different powers that are working against each other are determining, they're influential, but they're not determinist. Poverty doesn't have 100% wholly controlled results. And just as one bird flying upwards doesn't disprove gravity, one child who succeeds and goes to Oxbridge, one disadvantaged child, doesn't disprove inequality. There's still a great power of inequality that's happening alongside the examples that are exceptions. Do you think this, have I explained it okay, this idea of closed and open systems? People have double standards, so that although they accept that birds fly against gravity, you hear them on the radio saying, oh, this child got into Oxbridge even though she lived in the slums of Brixton or something like that. And so it just proves that anybody could. And that's a very simplistic way of assuming that society works on a closed system of one force only, instead of lots of competing forces. Although they're not wholly powerful, they're still very powerful. Another important thing that we talked about last time is absence. There's the infinite pull-push power of absence. Soon we'll all be going out into the absent future out of that door. And we've just come in from the absent past into this room. So absence is all that ever was and ever will be and is everywhere else, and all that might have happened but hasn't. And the example given is the monsoon that never arrives, so the crops fail and shape everybody's lives around the whole landscape. So critical realism is critical of monovalence, the single value idea, that we can only look at the present and the evident. And it argues that Western philosophy took the wrong turn thousands of years ago, when Plato and Parmenides, who were lawgivers, vetoed change. They wanted to keep the status quo. And they said we cannot talk about absence and non-existence, only about presence. But, however, absence is a great vacuum, and it's an emptiness which is essential for movement. If this room didn't have spaces in it, we wouldn't be able to move. If there weren't spaces between words in books, you wouldn't be able to see the words. If there wasn't silence between the notes of music, it would just be a jumble of noise. So that all this emptiness and space allows us to move forward and change. And we have to then acknowledge that in the new present, there's the absent past. So that every time we become something, we go from what we were, and we've lost a bit. Does all that make sense? And
I thought that was a good illustration you gave in the book about readers.
yes,
The child who becomes a reader has begun being someone who is read to as often.
yeah.
I thought that explained it well.
I'll just repeat it, shall I, Susan? Just imagine a girl of 5, 6, 7 who learns to read, And she's become a reader with a lot of opportunity and independence and choices. But she's no longer the dependent non-reader who had to go to people and say, what's this say? Will you read me a story? With closer, more dependent relationships, which were nice at the time. She's begone from that girl she was, and she's become a slightly different girl, and she's got slightly different relationships with everybody around her. And that's the begoing. That's, we talk a lot about becoming, but less about begoing. Now, now, about rights, going back to that shot of the Syrian bombing and no rights at all, you could say that rights are most real when they're absent. We don't claim rights to water or shelter or freedom to walk around. If we've got them, it's when we haven't, when we are starving, when we're in prison, when our house is being bombed. That's when we become most aware of our rights and our needs to claim them, to do something about them, to redeem them. Causal laws like gravity and invisible relationships of class and justice and different income can seem absent and invisible, but they are known in their effects. And so rights can similarly seem absent when they're violated. But that's when they're most crucial, because rights are tools and claims for change in life and freedom. And if we always respected all our rights all the time, we wouldn't even need words for them, because they wouldn't matter. It's when things are missing that we begin to notice how important they are. Oxygen would hardly be known or noticed. I mean, how often do we think about air and oxygen in the way that we think about food when we're hungry? We don't usually need to, because we're not gasping for air usually. Now, so childhood and adulthood are defined by one another, really often by their absences, by their difference, and what's missing or supposedly missing from each side. And my point that rights are inalienable means that they are there all the time and we are entitled to them by agreement. But it's when they're violated that we notice how much we need them. All right, absence and change. I think that rather repeats things that we've already said. Yeah. So, good. Difference and change. That's what I wanted to talk about. Now, there's a great difference in critical realism between difference and change. And a difference is a failing school is closed, and then it reopens with a new head teacher and a new uniform and a new name. But a lot of the rest is the same. And the school is different, but it hasn't really necessarily changed. All the people in it might well be the same and have similar relationships. Change, however, is about motive and transformation and emergence and risk and loss and gain. And it goes back to the girl who'd learned to read. She wasn't a different girl, she wasn't another girl, but she was a changed girl. She was the same girl who'd sustained a change in her identity and relationships and capacities. And change is an active, often intentional. So if a school really changes, it becomes more respectful of children's rights, for example, and so it introduces a proper school council that takes decisions that are respected and listened to and acted on. I've written a book with a school that changed, Highfield School, over 5 years, and it introduced all sorts of ideas like bully busters to stop bullying in the playground. Everybody was involved in negotiating and changing and looking at the problem, and guardians went around with children who needed a special help. And one day the head teacher said, oh, Peter's behaving really badly. I'll have to write to his parents and ask them to come to meet me. And the class said, no, ask his parents to come and meet us. And they had a circle time with Peter and his parents and came to negotiations as to how things would improve. So everyone in a non-discriminatory inclusive school, it means that everyone is actively involved in doing that. You can't really have a school where the adults do all the non-discrimination and inclusion, but nobody else does much about it. Or the other way around, of course. In these change schools, the students and staff are the same people, except they've changed to have a new sense of themselves and the other people and their identities and relationships. So there's continuity as well as change, and the same people in the same school sustain and enable that change. And you could argue that if you really want to change a school, rather than opening it as a different school, you have to look at this whole process of what are the problems and how together can we address them and work on them.
Presumably change isn't always positive though. What about the change from being mentally healthy to becoming mentally ill?
Yes, really good point. And I'd only thought about it in the last couple of weeks, because a lot of this, we're going to go on to the process of change, and it nearly always is the examples are positive, and I've been thinking about how important it is to look at negative. Change can happen on all, oh goodness, it's 7:30, isn't it? I was going to hope to have a lot more time for discussion and everything as well. What shall I do? Shall I just skim through the last slides, because then you can take them away? And maybe if you ever want to come and discuss them or something, you could set up something. Now, dialectic is about the river and the landscape around it, each altering each other, and dialectic is about the opposite, the adult and the child, interacting and changing together. Hegel had a three-part dialectic, thesis, synthesis, synthesis, and critical realism is much more about emergence and change, and so therefore has a four-stage one. And I'll just tell you this, because going on from the point about negative change, this is about the movements that we go through when we change, and also about research. And the first most important thing of all is to stand back and look at the real reality of rights for children before you arrived, what was going on. After you've gone, what would be going on? Their independent reality. And then the second part is to look at, well, in the case of rights, absence, needs, suffering, contradiction, missing. How can rights redress these? And to start thinking about intervening and acting. The third part is to reach an open totality, a new sort of school. Say after 2 or 3 years, the school is much more rights respecting, equal, everyone's more flourishing and happy. But instead of having synthesis, the end of the Hegel three-part dialectic, critical realism sees all these totalities, the whole child, the whole family, the whole school, the whole neighbourhood, all as partial totalities within others, and open ones that are open to change. And the fourth part is how we change in our hearts and minds in this new totality, adjusting to it. But we also often step up a level and think, well, it could be still better. So we can go back to the first movement and start this cycle again. It just doesn't end. We don't ever reach the finish. And I think if we ever had a good society, one of the most important things we'd have to build in is space for dissent, disagreement, protest. This isn't good enough. We've got to we'll never get to the end. Now, so most of this is in a positive way, but as you mentioned, so often it's in a negative way. And I'll give you the example. I think our Secretary of State for Education skips the first one and doesn't really look at what real children and real schools and the real process of learning are about. So he steps in and intervenes with new rules, and he verdicts and punishing attitudes and so on, and thinks that he's remedying wrongs and making corrections. However, there's a risk that this arrives at a totality that is not better than the one before. There are still awful lots of problems. But if some people are so convinced they're right, and they put in their new rules and their new punishments, and people still aren't behaving properly, then they tend to react by saying, well, we've got to psych up the punishments and the rules and make it even tougher. And that moves away from self-awareness and transformation and the idea of change. So these cycles, meld means, of course, the moment, edge, level dimension. These cycles can work in very positive ways, but they can work in negative ways. And each movement pushes on to the next through absence, through wanting things that are missing and wanting to get to them. And how you work, where you start from and how you push on to the next stage and then the next stage, through this dialectic of that's dynamic, full of movement and change, very much shapes how you're going to end up here, unless you can realise you're going wrong and try to make a big change. But that would still involve going back to the vital moment of observing and standing back and learning and thinking. And I was going to ask you to all get into pairs and discuss rights and citizenship and how we could use this meld pattern to understand ways to understand citizenship and rights more, but I'm afraid we've got to stop now. I didn't mean to take up the whole 2 hours we were just talking, sorry about that.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. Thank you. And just to say, we hope